Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast for the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I'm your host, Daniel Fiott, and for this 22nd episode of Strategy Speaks, I'm really pleased to welcome Jung and Ramón Pacheco Pardo for a discussion on US alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Jung is a distinguished associate fellow at CSDS and served as US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, where she was responsible for the US's relationship with a host of Indo-Pacific states. And Ramón holds the Korea Foundation VUB Korea Chair at CSDS, as well as being a Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Welcome to you both. Let me start the conversation, if I can, Jung, by coming to you first and asking for your thoughts and reflections on two rather important strategies, right? So we've seen the US National Security Strategy of 2025 and then the Defense Strategy of 2026. They both state that the Trump administration will seek to strengthen alliances in the Indo-Pacific without necessarily or directly confronting China. How do you think the US is actually doing on that front at the moment?
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be here with you and Ramón today. Happy to have this discussion, this timely discussion today. I think when you talk about the U.S. national security strategy and the national defense strategy of 2026, I don't think we saw any surprises in terms of the Trump administration had been pretty consistent in its tone, in its focus, since it came into office in early 2026. So when the national defense strategy and the national security strategy focuses more on the Western Hemisphere and the U.S. homeland, as well as counter migration and counter narcotics, those are all things that the Trump administration had been trying to do in the year prior to the issuance of the document. So I think no surprises on that. I think for people like us who had been focused on the big national security challenges, not just in Europe, but in the United States, and even with the first Trump administration, the focus was intensely on China and in the Indo-Pacific. And while the second Trump administration's does focus on China and the first island chain specifically, and on Indo-Pacific more generally, the intensity is not there, I think, in the way that we saw. The tone also is very different. It's very President Trump heavy. He appears, his President Trump appears multiple times in the documents. There's a tone to the documents that are very different from the way the previous administrations talked about allies. It's allies must do more, and of course other administrations, the Biden administration included, talked about allies needing to do more, but it was said in a more diplomatic way. So the talk about allies, the tone is very different. The tone on European allies is very different, I think, which has been very alarming, and we saw, that's borne out in the past several months. Now, how is the U.S. doing with allies? I think with the European allies, it's been pretty tense with Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference last year, Secretary Rubio's speech this year was less strident, but still hit the same tones and hit the same ideas. But allies don't necessarily just want military alliances. They don't just want military things. They want to tackle corruption. They want to tackle schools. They need development assistance. And allies and friends in the Indo-Pacific, they're vastly different. You have Japan and Korea and the top rung of the economic and technological and developmental space. And then you have the very small Pacific Islands, which I was also in charge for at the State Department, where there's a lot of poverty, extreme poverty, and climate change has really degraded their ability to economically develop, and they also suffer from political corruption. And so, allies don't just want military alliances. I think the Trump administration's these documents tone and the way they're talking about allies need to do more are going to continue to reinforce for our allies that that maybe the U.S. is not credible and that their commitment is shaky. I will also mention that that allies have always been looking for reassurance and looking for U.S. credibility. So questioning U.S. credibility is not a new thing, but when you see the administration taking actions that do in fact look like they're turning the other way, I think that makes allies very worried about what the administration might do, including in President Trump's visit to Beijing in April.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that's a great way to kick off our discussion, and I think I very much liked how you framed the approach with some hints of continuity, but you then also referred, I think, very rightly to maybe a shift in tone, a shift on the China approach. And I think another important element there is also what you did in terms of how we define alliances and what allies think they're getting from a relationship. So I think that's a very good segue actually to the question I have for Ramón, who of course knows South Korea extremely well. And Ramón, on that point, I want to maybe bridge with what Jung has just said about this idea of allies being reassured and not just necessarily being in it for the military dimension as well. And looking specifically at South Korea and its relatively new leadership that it has in place as well. Maybe you can talk to us and to the listeners a bit about how you see the Trump administration's approach to alliances in the region and how that's actually perceived by Seoul itself in its own development as a regional actor.
I think that what Jung indicated is right, and what you see in Korea is this discussion as to what extent can you rely on the U.S., on the current administration, but also I think you have seen a very pragmatic approach by the new president, by Lee Jae-myung, realizing, as he said actually in his first trip to the U.S. last summer, that it is very difficult today to have a good relationship with both the US and China. So in a sense, Seoul, whether openly or not, has had to make a choice, and the choice is going to be the United States for historical reasons, for defense and security reasons, but increasingly also for economic reasons. Korea feels that it is competing more and more against China. Whereas it has to have a good access to the U.S. market, which continues to be the biggest in the world, the consumer market. So I think what you have seen, as opposed to what we have witnessed here in Europe, is this idea of we have to deal with the alliance as it is. I think in Europe it took us a bit longer to realize that this is a new U.S. And I think in Korea very quickly the realization was that the Trump administration is different from the previous one, for example, where Jung was serving, or the US in the past. So I think you have seen more alignment with the US, more discussion about what the alliance can do beyond North Korea, because clearly the US doesn't see the alliance, or the current US administration doesn't see the alliance solely focused on North Korea. It wants the alliance to focus on China, focus on other matters as well. So in a sense, there is a renegotiation of the purpose of the alliance, the contribution of each of the two partners, but especially Korea as the junior partner. And if you look at the economic front, a continuation really of what you have seen in previous years, more investment going into the United States. Korean companies have made very clear, without US technology, they cannot build their products. They may lose part of the Chinese market because they have to align more closely with the US, but at least they will be able to build their products, which they wouldn't be able to do with certain US technologies. I'm talking about the semiconductors, even the humanoid robotics, for example, which have in the news recently. And you have seen a very open approach to leveraging President Trump's personality. So if you look, for example, at the so-called MASGA agreement, so Korea agreeing to invest $150 billion on the shipping industry in the US. This is based on the MAGA approach, right? The Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. So very direct messaging, very clearly stating that this is thanks to the leadership of President Trump, right? Things that he likes to hear. But I would also say, as we saw last year in the APEC summit, when for the first time President Trump and President Xi Jinping met, and this was hosted by Korea, you saw how Korea still wants a relationship with China and would rather have the US and China getting along better. So you see, for example, the visit of President Trump to China in a couple of months, in a few weeks' time. Korea is one of the countries that is welcoming it. It may not get what it wants out of the meeting, but at least if there is a degree of diplomacy between the two of them, I think Korea feels more comfortable. The other thing I would say is that, like many other countries, Korea is looking for other partners. So you see good relations with Japan continuing, regardless of who is the Japanese prime minister, because each has already dealt with two different Japanese prime ministers. You see the rapprochement with Europe as well. You see Korea trying to get closer to countries such as Australia, looking at Southeast Asia, also for economic reasons as well. So this diversification that we're discussing here in Europe, I think, comes natural to Korea. One last point that I would add as well is that for the time being, I think there's going to be no change in the policy of Korea. But I also do think that we need to see what happens now with the tariffs agreements that are being renegotiated. What type of agreement may the US reach with China? What may happen between the US and Russia as they discuss Ukraine? Because I think all of this will influence the way Korea sees its alliance with the US.
Yeah, excellent points, Ramon, and especially that the conundrum that you raise of South Korea being, in a position of having to balance somehow the sensitivities of China and the US, but also being quite deft at communicating well to the Trump administration, which is, I think, certainly something in Europe that we can take a few lessons from. And in fact, one of the points that you also raised was maybe the Europeans were slightly late, or maybe are still late in adapting to this new reality and to the new US administration. And that actually leads me on to a follow-up question I have for you, Ramon, actually, because as you were speaking, I was reminded a little bit about the similarities between Korea and Europe, and especially the messaging coming from the US administration on defense. And in the national defense strategy, also picking up this concept of primary responsibility, which is being, directed at both Europeans and South Korea as well in terms of defense and deterrence. And I think in the case of South Korea, the language was quite direct in primary responsibility and, facing the challenge from North Korea with, let's say, more limited US support, as the document says. How do you think that's being seen in Seoul at the moment? I mean, what does that mean actually for South Korean defense policy moving forward?
Well, I think we have this interesting situation in which you have a liberal president in Korea, and usually liberals in Korea want to have more of a say on their own foreign and security policy. And you have seen, for example, the issue of OPCON transfer, the transfer of operational control of the combined forces in times of war, and how the Korean president, is really pushing heavily for it because he thinks he can get it out of the Trump administration. So he has this period of 3 more years until the Trump administration is over. And this fits very well with the message coming from the US that allies should take more leading role in their own security and what liberals want to achieve, which is operational control of the armed forces in case of war with North Korea. I think what you see at the same time is Korea taking advantage of this very pragmatic but also transactional approach by the Trump administration. So if you look at the agreement about nuclear powered submarines, a long-term goal of Korea, the Korean government went to the Trump administration and said, well, this is going to lead to Korea being able to defend itself better, but also there's obviously going to be an economic benefit, huge economic benefit for the United States, which obviously Trump is one of the priorities that he has in terms of his foreign policy. So I think that this pragmatism is going to continue, trying to take as much advantage as possible of this situation. But also, if you look at the debate within the country itself, not only liberals but many conservatives, they realize that it is true that Korea has to take the lead in its own security because the US has other priorities. And you mentioned then, if we look at the Indo-Pacific region, clearly it is the deterrence of China. And the discussion, for example, about that dual contingency, what happens if there is a war in the Taiwan Strait, but also in the Korean Peninsula at the same time? So North Korea, for example, taking advantage of a Chinese strike on Taiwan. I think Korea clearly knows that it will be the first line of defense, and the US will be preoccupied with other matters. So that's something that Korea has taken to heart. I would also say, even if you look at the previous administration, if you look at the defense budget, right, it had been growing consistently for a number of years, because I do think that many Koreans have realized that this is not going to change, that the Trump administration may be more upfront about this, but that there's expectation that they will be doing more. I mean, same here with NATO, right? I mean, the Trump administration has been very clear that in Europe we need to spend more on our own defense, but Trump was not the first president to raise this issue. It has been raised for decades, right? Never mind years. And I think it's similar in Korea. The realization that Korea needs to do more for itself is not new, but clearly has been accelerated since the Trump administration came to office. But as I said, I do think that the current Korean government welcomes this because it aligns very well with its priority, which is more autonomy for Korea in its foreign and security policy.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ramón. A deep dive into the kind of psychology behind all of this. And again, I think you raised some really interesting parallels there with Europe and NATO and some of the expectations now that are being put on European allies by the Trump administration. And I certainly think we probably need a bit more time, but I certainly think the word you used of realization setting in, that this is probably the norm now and not the exception, I think is very important. And it's certainly in the case of South Korea, again, maybe a form of inspiration for Europeans to look at as well in terms of how that's being handled, notwithstanding the, of course, regional differences. That also leads me to come back now to Jung, if I can, and maybe to round off the discussion and zoom back out again from the Korean Peninsula. And in preparation for our discussion, I was looking through some recent analysis, which is kind of like as a score sheet for how analysts in the US are thinking about how the US is actually doing in the Indo-Pacific and on its Indo-Pacific strategy. And we had, I think, very recently a quite a thought-provoking piece, which is basically called, the US pivot to Asia, essentially a failure. Ever since it began, which I found quite provocative, but also interesting. And I thought I would pose that question to you, perhaps unfairly, which is a way of basically asking you, first of all, to maybe go into a bit more detail on how you assess the current US posture in the region. And you've already said a few things about that, but also on this point about failure and maybe giving it a more positive spin, to get your views and ideas on how you think the US administration could, continue to maintain influence in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years.
Thanks, Daniel. Important questions. I think the analyses calling the pivot a failure or not doing enough, I think it just really underscores how hard strategy is, and that perhaps we can look at this as how hard the pivot is, right? That strategy is hard to do. It goes in fits and starts, and it's not necessarily linear. And I think one of the things that was a real kneecapped moment was when we withdrew from the TPP, because when you go into the region, that's it comes up all the time in the dialogues and the conversations and multilateral fora. What is the U.S.'s economic position in the region, and that always is brought out as one of the signature, I don't know, more under signature things that really kneecapped the pivot to Asia, the lack of a perceived economic position in the region. So strategy is hard. The pivot has been harder, and because the United States is not just a one focus or one issue country when it comes to national strategy, whenever there's a fire anywhere in the world, that takes precedence because of our duty to protect Americans, our duty to protect allies, and to prevent a bigger conflict from spreading across the globe. So, and of course, there's the domestic angle too. What the presidents are not just foreign policy animals, but that they're also domestic. They have to win elections. So, so I think all of those factors go into showing why strategy is hard. That's not a defense of not doing enough, but I think it, to put it into a bigger context of strategy. Secondly, I'll mention that that U.S. turned to Asia and the region being so receptive to U.S. presence, as Ramón referred to earlier, is because China's doing not nice things. It's been undertaking coercive activities in the South China Sea, and exacerbating corruption in the Pacific, and using its economic heft and its political heft to try to browbeat and give a thumping to some of our smaller allies. And China continues to do that because it's in its national interest to continue to use economic levers and political levers to go their way. So the U.S. role in the Indo-Pacific is important, and I think the region has long now understood that the U.S. role in the Indo-Pacific is very important. And when I do an assessment of how the U.S. is doing in the region, I think it depends on where you look and who you ask. It's kind of like the elephant, what part the blind men are touching the elephant and what part of the elephant are they touching? And it's not necessarily that these countries would agree with me, but I think when you look at the U.S. is doing certain things. It might not be doing the lattice work thing that the Biden administration was trying to do, with trying to link Europe and the Indo-Pacific and trying to get many like-minded groupings together to solve the world's problems, climate change, for example, and Open RAN, and cybersecurity, et cetera. So the U.S. is still doing stuff with allies. It's the trilateral with South Korea and Japan continues to be fairly strong, and I think that's in large part because there is a huge demand signal from South Korea and Japan to continue on that relationship. When you see some of the readouts from the various high-level visits, the U.S. is still committing to extended deterrence and to tackling critical challenges together. The Quad is doing stuff, right? So for most recently, the Quad is devoting $20 million to support a resilient and safe and secure telecommunications in Palau, for example. So the U.S. is doing stuff. Now, to the extent that that it's doing is it's not working on the lattice work. It's not trying to bind these alliances and partnerships together. So the tone is different, the language is different, but I want to underscore that there are elements in the U.S. government that are working towards goals that are pretty consistent with what was happening in the previous administrations, including the Trump 1.0. I think the problem here is one more point is that the South Korea Japan rapprochement that took 30 years at least. It took many decades for that to bear out. So it's not, in my mind, it's not a matter of one team winning and the other team losing, but this is the long game that requires time and effort and energy, and it's not a linear progress. But I do worry about what this current administration is doing with their allies, in large part, and I'll get to my final point, which is that because things are not linear, events don't happen or unfold in a linear way. I get the sense from this administration that in focusing on China and the first island chain and allies doing more for themselves in their own region, that it assumes one conflict at a time. And I think what we've seen in the past several years with North Korean troops and material going to Russia to support a war in Europe, the so-called CRINC and the resilient partnership that they have, that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea have formed over the past year plus, past couple of years, that what happens in the Indo-Pacific doesn't just stay in the Indo-Pacific, and what happens in Europe doesn't just happen in Europe. What happens in the South China Sea or on the Taiwan Strait, I don't think it's just going to be contained in that particular region. It's going to involve all of our allies and partners with their various strengths to prevent a larger conflict from forming. So I think Ramón is absolutely right that our allies, including South Korea, are working in a pragmatic way. They're taking the personalist approach, which seems to be working for certain countries, at least for a discrete period of time, and that bilaterally, the relationships might be different, but when we zoom out, the multilateral situation and the overall approach to alliances and partnerships is troubling, and really it does undermine U.S. national security.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jung. I think you covered a lot of ground there, and you also provided, actually, I think, quite a balanced assessment of U.S. action, for want of a better term, in the Indo-Pacific. And I think you also did a really great thing of reminding us that we're only really talking about the Indo-Pacific consistently because of China's actions and coercive actions in the region. And I think, and it's probably a great way to end the episode as well, to take on board what you said about strategy making itself, which I think we often lose sight of that it's a time investment, political investment that takes sometimes multiple decades to get right. So even though we may sometimes think that strategy is failing, we should probably give it a bit more time and stick at it, as it were, in the region. So thanks so much to you, Jung, and to Ramón for spending time with Strategy Speaks today and for sharing your views. I think it was a very in-depth look at how the US is shaping up its alliance structures and alliances within the Indo-Pacific region. I think this is a discussion which, of course, resonates very highly with our audience. And I'm hopefully going to be able to invite you again in the future for further discussions as these questions continue to evolve and challenge us. So thanks so much, Jung and Ramón, for joining us for this 22nd episode of Strategy Speaks. Thank you.